My name is Serena Longo, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so pleased to introduce this virtual event with Pat Shipman presenting her new book, Our Oldest Companions, joined in conversation by Wendy Williams. Thank you for joining us virtually this afternoon. Harvard Bookstore's virtual event series continues this fall, bringing authors and their work to our community and, of course, our digital community. Find our event schedule at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and shop our shelves from home. This afternoon's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk today, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. This event will also have auto-generated closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen, or if you prefer not to see them, you can also hide them that way as well. In the chat, I'll be posting links to purchase Our Oldest Companions on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like this one possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore during a difficult time for small businesses. Thank you all for showing up and tuning in support of authors, publishers, and indie bookselling. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you have no doubt experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and understanding. And so now I'm delighted to introduce today's speakers. Pat Shipman is the author of several previous titles, including The Invaders, The Animal Connection, and with Alan Walker, The Ape in the Tree, which won the W. Howells Award from the American Anthropological Association. She is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the Royal Geographical Society of London. Joining Pat on our digital stage this afternoon is Wendy Williams, best-selling author of The Horse, The Epic History of Our Noble Companion, among other titles. They'll be discussing Pat's new book, Our Oldest Companions, The Story of the First Dogs. Ian Davidson calls it the latest in a string of authoritative and readable books by Pat Shipman, and continues, this book, like the dogs that are at its center, covers the continents where modern people have lived with them. Read it, you will enjoy it. We're so pleased to be hosting this event today. The digital podium is yours, Pat and Wendy.
Thank you.
Hi, Pat. How are you?
I'm good.
I'm glad you're
Nice to
doing
be
well. I don't know why my screens have disappeared here, but it's really fun to be talking to you. I know you're in central Pennsylvania and I'm down here on Cape Cod, where we just had a terrible storm and the electricity went out. A lot of people still don't have electricity several days later. I do, fortunately, just in time to be able to talk with you via computer here. And this is really fun to be interviewing you about your new book, because a year ago you interviewed me about my new book, The Language of Butterflies. So now I'm here to talk to you about your new book, Our Oldest Companion. Hold on, shameless advertising. Here it is. Here's our book, The Our Oldest Companion. And I have to tell you that some people might know that I'm working on a book about dogs myself, which won't be out for a while. So I've read an awful lot of the academic dog literature books. And I have to say, this is definitely the best book about dog domestication I've ever read. I've read huge numbers of them. Not all of them are fascinating and page turners, but yours is excellent. It's very comprehensive and it covers cultures and their connections to dogs all over the world, which I personally found particularly valuable. I love hearing about how other countries, other cultures, places as far away as New Guinea, New Zealand, and Australia treat their dogs. What's the relationship that people have with their dogs there, and how is it the same as our relationship in America, and how is it different? So that's what I wanted to say first. This is a really excellent, comprehensive piece of work, and I know it took you years to work on it. So congratulations to you. This is a real capstone to your career. I have a first question for you, and this is something that I think about when I'm doing my own. why are we interested in dogs? Why study dogs? Why are dogs important to the scientific community?
On the one hand, you could say we study dogs because a whole lot of us really like dogs
Mhm.
and are interested in them, and they're fascinating creatures with remarkable adaptations. But that's not all of it. Dogs were the first species to be domesticated by a long shot. I would say they were domesticated 30 to 40,000 years ago. Other people would put it much more recently. And the reason that we don't agree is because there isn't any typed label that says domestic dog
Mhm.
versus wolf or
Right.
canid, the general term for the group. What I think is that domestication is one of the most remarkable discoveries ever made in the history of the world. What domestication lets us do is cooperate and collaborate with another species, a different species with different abilities, different strengths, different weaknesses, and borrow their skills. We don't have to become an animal with big fangs in our jaws because we have big fanged animals that will use their fangs to our advantage and, of course, to theirs. So the idea that you could take an animal like a wolf, which is where this all starts, and turn it into the lovely puppy sitting in front of the fire, or the waggly one chewing up your shoe
Mhm.
on the floor, is just remarkable. We don't have to do all the things dogs do well or wolves do well in order to benefit from their abilities. So I think, first of all, it's a brilliant discovery that no one had ever made, no one had ever conceived of before dogs started being dogs. That's one issue. Another is that in the process, we have developed means of communicating with dogs that are really quite extraordinary. Lots of people have trained dogs. I know you have a border collie that loves to herd sheep.
He
And
loves to do everything.
yeah, well, dogs are very happy animals,
Yes.
mostly, if
Mostly.
nobody is mistreating them.
Right.
And in a way, that's one of their strengths. They have a great ability to enjoy things.
Yes.
You know, it's not just, oh, are we having dog food for dinner again? It's, oh, boy, we're having dog food today.
Right. Right.
And that's a tremendous quality.
It is a tremendous quality. You know, I reread your book over the last couple of days to prepare this for this interview. And it occurred to me that one of the intrinsic things about dogs that we haven't really thought about is dogs are pretty much always smiling, or at least we interpret it as smiling. I
Yeah.
don't know what they really mean when they stick out their tongue and go like this. Yeah. Do you want to go somewhere? Yeah. Do you want to have dog food again? Yeah. Do you want to go for a ride? Yeah. You know, and so we interpret that, I think, as a smile, and human beings are programmed to love smiles. So maybe that's a really basic thing that we have that connects us to them. It's mysterious what this connection is, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And it's also led to maybe the second big reason for studying dogs. Not only are they domestic animals, not only are they the first domestic animal, but we live with them everywhere. Everywhere people go, they live with dogs. They either take them with them or they find them once they're there. And because they have helped us in hunting, in herding, in protection in carrying things, in sensing things, either by smell or hearing, which is much better than ours, I'll tell you. So we take dogs with us every place we go. And so one way of studying us and studying our migrations around the world and our adaptations to different habitats and different ecosystems is to study dogs. Maybe there's only 10 people in a group, but there might be 30 dogs. And so there is a whole new source of evidence from the dog's remains, from their genes, from the way they alter things. I'm thinking about sticks here, but it doesn't have to be sticks. It could be many things.
Yes.
They tell us that the dogs were there. And in fact, remarkably, almost from the beginning of dogs, we have treated them like people. Now we treat them very much like people. We buy them Halloween costumes. We give them birthday presents. We dress them up for things. Some people arrange doggy weddings, but we also bury them.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you think that people evolved the way that we evolved in part because of our relationship with dogs?
Yes, absolutely.
How have dogs affected our own personal evolution?
One of the things you have to do if you're going to domesticate any animal is develop a means of communicating with them. You have to pay attention to what they're doing, to their posture, to their expression, to the noises they're making, to the gestures they're making. And of course, those are pretty useful traits with other people, is paying attention to what they mean, to how they're standing. What does that posture mean? You know, does it mean they're uptight and rigid and not comfortable, or are they relaxed and comfortable and happy? So it has forced us, maybe encouraged us certainly, into developing communication skills.
Now, along these lines, I have another question that I've been thinking about for years, and I'm going to stick it to you now. You're going to have to answer it for me. What does it mean to domesticate an animal? Dogs in particular, but as you know, I'm interested in horses. I'm interested in kind of in cats. I mean, I suppose I'm interested in cats. But I grew up with a pretty rigid definition of domestication, and that it means that we control their breeding. And yet, as you and I have traveled around the world, we've seen many examples where animals have been domesticated, but their breeding has not been controlled. You and I have talked a lot about horses in Mongolia. Of course, there's the Taki horses in Mongolia that are completely free roaming, but the way people keep their own riding horses in Mongolia out in, I don't want to say herd, out in bands, out in the open. There's no fences in Mongolia. There's a law against having fences in Mongolia, in fact. So the animals are out there doing their own thing. And when someone wants to go get one of his horses, he rides out to where the bands are and he brings that horse in. Ergo, nobody's controlling the breeding of those horses when they're out loose in those bands on the plains. So the traditional definition of domestication does not work. What is domestication? What does it mean? Doesn't mean anything.
And it means everything. It is a very tricky issue you've brought up, because we believe that domesticated animals have a genetic component. That means they will what's called breed true. If it's having a black horse, then they're always going to turn out black, or nearly always. If it's a dog with exceptional scent skills, then it's the genetics that makes their sense of smell particularly acute and accurate and tap into-able. That's a terrible phrase, but
accessible, do you mean maybe?
Accessible.
Accessible to us. We can access that ability.
Yes, and so can they. Technically, domestication is living in the domus, living in the house, and which is one reason I don't much like the word domestication, because not every species that we regard as domesticated can possibly live in the house. Trees don't live in the house, but some trees are domesticated. So there is a lot of ambiguity there in the way we use the word, but it has to do with both having a behavioral component and a genetic component. And that often means controlling the breeding, but as you have aptly demonstrated with your story about Mongolian horses, it's not always what we think of as controlling the breeding. It's not fencing them in or tying them down or shutting them in a room. And a lot of animals don't do very well under those conditions. They object almost viscerally to being confined and what they might say is trapped in a given way. So I think domestication is a very strange word. And the fact that we use it to apply both plants and animals is, to my mind, completely ridiculous.
So what would you give as your view of a one sentence or a two sentence definition of domestication according to our modern knowledge? I think the old style of the old definition of domestication had to do with a Eurocentric view of animals, in which the animals were kept enclosed and controlled. And now that we're more global and we've seen so many different ways that people can have relationships with animals, we need to widen that so it includes traditional peoples in New Guinea or traditional peoples in Australia or traditional peoples in Mongolia. How would you define it now in 2021?
With difficulty and great care. A domesticated animal has to agree to the whole situation. Some animals will not be domesticated, no matter what you do, no matter how hard you try, no matter what pressures you exert on them. If they aren't going to do it, they aren't going to do it. And that has been shown time and again. One of the examples I cite in the book is zebras. Now you say, wait a minute, horses are domesticated, donkeys are domesticated, burros are domesticated. So how come you can't do it with a zebra? Well, because zebras won't do it.
They don't want it. A funny story that I love, when our friend Rothschild from the Victorian era had zebras that he drove down to the Queen's house for tea once, but he had to leave really quickly because all the Queen's children were surrounding the zebras and the zebras were starting to bite. He didn't think it would be a good idea for the prince and princesses to get bitten, so he took off. So you can, I think this is what you mean, you can force an animal into the frame of domestication, but that doesn't necessarily mean the animal's going to cooperate. I think that's maybe what you mean.
And, you know, the same as the people have to cooperate. If we stop being so person-centric and say, okay, wait a minute, we're choosing to live in this particular way, in this particular place. And we have these rules about like not biting the children or, you know, or not kicking the table apart.
Yes.
We're not breaking down the door or jumping out the window.
Yes.
And things like that happen all the time with animals that just don't want to be domesticated.
I hear that zebras can really kick down doors and
Yeah,
can do a lot of harm.
some zookeepers say they're the most dangerous animal in the zoo.
That's
Yeah.
what I've heard. That's
That-
what I've heard.
May have to do with dangerous as in they aren't willing to do what I want them to do,
Mm.
is what that means. But there are rules of behavior. And if you and the other species do not agree on those rules of behavior, you're going nowhere with domestication.
That's the best discussion of domestication I've ever heard. The animal has to agree to it, and there's a lot of animals who just don't.
Well, most animals
Mm.
don't.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that you would start this whole procedure, for God's sake, with a wolf,
Mm.
which is one of the most feared and abused animals in the world. People are terrified of wolves, with reason. You know, wolves are big, strong animals, and they're predators.
Mm.
And they don't care if that's your best sofa or if that's your child.
Yeah.
And so I can remember talking with ranchers who live right outside of Yellowstone National Park and who are still very upset about the fact that wolves were released back into the park and are living again freely in Yellowstone Park. And they'd say, well, how would you feel if somebody put one of those in your backyard? And I'm not sure I would feel very good about it, frankly, but it is actually better for the ecosystem of Yellowstone, better for the streams, better for many of the plants, better for many of the animals. And so you have to say, for the privilege of having that wildness preserved, we need to make some accommodations, and heaven knows there are many programs to help ranchers and farmers whose livestock have been eaten or injured or maimed by wolves. But you know, if what you're aiming for is the domestic dog, starting with a wolf is a really goofy idea.
Well, let's go back to that idea, because in your book, you talk a lot about the wolf dog. I wanted to ask you about your choosing of that particular term, wolf dog. What does that mean? Why did you choose that particular term? And how do you imagine that this process first started? There's a lot of theories. I'd love to hear yours.
Okay. I call them wolf dogs because I couldn't find a better term. I wrote and talked to a lot of people, including people who have a wolf and dog cross. I met one. And
the person or the wolf dog?
the wolf dog.
The wolf dog. Okay.
And I was very happy that the person liked me and that the wolf dog could see the person liked me, because I'm not sure I would have been very happy if the wolf dog had decided I was not a good person. And what I mean by that is not the animal that is occasionally and foolishly bred and tried and attempted to be sold for big bucks, because for some reason there are people who want a very macho animal, and a wolf dog sounds like one. And I could see how very frightening this animal could be. Although it was not trying to be frightening to me, it was kind of the withholding of the ferocity that was frightening. So you have to call them something.
Mm.
And people have tried various terms, and I'm not fond of anyone in particular, but at a certain point you have to jump in and swim. And so I have been calling them wolf dogs and then having to go through a big explanation of what I don't mean by wolf dog. And the behavior of wolf dogs, of hybrids of wolves and dogs, depends very much on how much wolf they get. And some of them are really pretty aggressive and ferocious and not something you want sitting in your living room. And others are just sweethearts and are lovely animals. And I think it's partly their upbringing and it's partly their genetics that some of them get the nice genes.
Speaking of genetics, we get into that dicey question of when we look at the domestication of dogs and the process of dogs and humans beginning to work together. We talked the other day about the science of paleontology versus the science of genetics. And I think the way that you phrased this is, do we believe the bones or do we believe the genes? I personally feel, and I'm not a scientist, but my personal feeling when I read some of the genetics is that the geneticists can sometimes be a little bit overbearing, a little bit, they want clarity where clarity might not yet exist. Let me put it that way. So can you talk a little bit about the difference between what genetics research tells us about canine domestication and what paleontology tells us? And how are we in the general public to reconcile these two views?
With difficulty. I was sort of raised a paleontologist, raised on the anatomy, raised on the reality of a bone I can hold in my hand, and I can look at it, and even if it's an animal unfamiliar, I can tell you something about how that animal lived and moved. And the more I know about the animal and the more bones I have, the greater depth I can go into, but it doesn't lie. It's very tangible, it's very concrete. And that doesn't mean that any human being with a given skeleton, 2 arms, 2 legs, a torso, a head, hands and feet, they can't all be ballerinas. They can't all be world-class sprinters or high jumpers or swimmers or anything else. Potentially the body can be moved that way. The genetics is for me much dicier. There are about, I am told, I never counted myself, 16,000 genes in a genome.
For humans.
For humans.
Okay.
For an awful lot of animals, let's say.
Okay.
Let's take that as a ballpark figure.
Okay.
You could be wrong about a whole lot of those genes, about literally how they are made up. Well, with 16,000, come on, let's be serious. Maybe you aren't going to get every single one right. And more than that, we don't know what most of those genes do. They turn things on and they turn things off, or they negate another gene, or they enhance another gene's action. And the reality is we just don't know what they all do. And we don't know if you mess with them a little bit, when does the function stop? When does the function not function? So if you're going to tell me it's the genes of the bones, my bias is always to take the bones. You can't be, if you know much at all about anatomy, you can't be that far wrong on the bones, on what it is, on where it goes in a body, and on how it functions, and the shape and the internal structure of the bone and its connection to other bones and to muscles, of course, and nerves and blood vessels. And it's all very complicated, but you don't get, you don't take somebody's arm for their leg.
Well, I think
Whereas-
one of the things you and I have talked about is the paucity of samples, and that, excuse me, some of these claims, and they may be true, I don't know, I'm not a scientist, but some of these claims are fairly large, but they're made based on very few sample sizes. Did I explain that correctly? Is that your thinking?
Yes,
Okay.
there are 7 billion, give or take, people on the planet. We have nowhere close to 7 billion genomes.
Mm-hmm.
And there are all kinds of mutations, and there are all kinds of interactions among the genes, some of which are predictable and a whole lot of which are not. So we can say if you've got the red gene and somebody else has the yellow gene, probably you're going to be different colors, whatever that means. But it's never just one gene. It's all multiple gene effects, and it's all sequences or cascades of genes in operation.
Mm.
And so maybe, for example, somebody was talking about spots on the underside of different animals. Many baby animals have spotty tummies. They're just adorable. And we look at their pictures and we go, oh, look at that little spotty tummy. It's so cute. And it is. But by the time the animal grows up, it doesn't have any spots. Oh, that's a developmental stage. That's not a yes or no. You have 5 fingers, or you have 4 fingers, or you have 6 fingers. It's not as simple as that. And so I feel that because it's a new science, because it's extremely complicated and involves statistics and exacting laboratory procedures and machines that cost more money than you make in a year.
Well, that's not much.
No, geneticists tend to feel like they have the truth. And those poor idiots like me who rely on the morphology, on the shape, on the physical characteristics of a piece of bone are wandering through the bushes, frankly. And I don't like the implication. I don't think it's true. And I think the behavior is so much more than just what genes you've got. I mean,
Well, let me bring one particular question into focus here. In the last several years, different research teams have concluded that dog domestication began up in Siberia near what was then the land bridge to North America. Another team concluded that dog domestication began in Europe. Another team has concluded that dog domestication began in South China. And then common sense, people who think in terms of animals suggest that maybe it began in a number of different places throughout the early ages, and that perhaps it started and died out, perhaps it started somewhere else and died out. So how are we, to the general public, to understand these various claims about where dogs were domesticated or earlier where horses were domesticated? I know we have the same kind of controversy in the field of horses that I'm very interested in. How do we reconcile these differing points of view?
You can do a couple of things. One is you can roll the dice and just take a shot at it. More productively, I think you can entertain lots of types of evidence, lots of different evidence, and see, at least I think I can see it, that it's a very complicated story. And that it's not just one day, you know, the lightning bolt comes down and they say, look, that's a dog. That's the first dog. And we're in, you know, Zimbabwe. Well, maybe you are. But then again, are we talking about a spontaneous creation of something, and does it have to last to be a whole new species, which basically a domestic animal is? And can it backbreed with its cousins who never underwent that transition? I think it's a very nuanced and complicated story, and it's probably never going to be simple. It's also survival under different circumstances or adaptation to different circumstances. There's some remarkable work done by people in Siberia about sled dogs. And there's some remarkable work done about dogs that, as far as anyone can tell, were bred to hunt polar bears.
Yeah, I was so fascinated by that story. Talk a little bit about how long ago people began working in tandem with dogs, wolf dogs, whatever we want to call them, in order to be able to hunt polar bears. That's a great story.
Well, it's a remarkable thing, and it just leaves me stunned.
It helps us understand why these dogs might choose to associate with humans, because they could get more done with the humans than on their own.
Yes. This is the farthest north settlement of people that has ever been, as far as we know. So this is way the heck north, and now a lot of it is underwater. But let's not be picky. This is now, that was then. And people did two things in the warmer weather. They hunted reindeer, which we have a fairly easy time producing a mental image of what it is when you hunt reindeer. Of course, knowing that the dangerous time, if you're hunting reindeer, is when you actually bring the animal down. That's when you get close to it. That's when it kicks your teeth in. That's when it stabs you with its wonderful horns or whatever. The winter occupation of people in the same area is to hunt polar bears, because the polar bears den either to have babies and raise them, or simply to hibernate out the winter. And so they make snow caves. The bears make snow caves. There are areas that are much more amenable to making that kind of shelter than others. So there is a tendency for the denning areas to be clustered. I don't mean, you know, side by cheek by jowl, but I mean in a general area, general habitat of geomorphology. And the large dogs that people raised and apparently selectively bred for smell out the dens and go in the entrance and chase the bears, frighten the bears into the backs of the caves. And the dogs, of course, are raising holy hell and barking, being vicious dogs, and so on. And so eventually the idea is that they frighten the polar bears so much that they go up through the roof. They breach the cave through the roof, sticking their head up. Now, this is deep snow. This is not 6 inches. This is deep snow. And at least for a while, the bears are sitting there with their head out in the open where anybody can see them, and the rest of them stuck in the cave. At which point, the people, the humans, shoot the bears with spears or arrows, projectile weapons. So you don't have to get up right next to that bear, which is still a damn big, dangerous animal. Once you have killed the bear, you call in your other dogs, which are a little smaller, but which are sled dogs. And they take the 500-pound bear back to your settlement, back to where the people live, back to where they can cook it and chop it up and share it around, and also pay it due respect, because there's a lot of symbolic religious belief attached to these animals, which after all keep the humans alive in a god-awful place through the winter, through the deep snow, and all the other things. So there are these two distinct kinds of dogs that you find in these settlements that are just wild. The sled dogs, and anybody who knows anything about sled dogs knows that breeding a good sled dog is not a trivial thing. And the polar bear chasing dogs. I mean, what an amazing specialization and habit of hunting and staying alive in a really hostile environment.
Hi,
So
folks.
it's a beautiful piece of work. Yeah.
Just jumped in here as promised to pivot things to Q&A if this seems like a good moment.
Seems great.
That was an
We can
amazing
do that.
story. Thank you, Pat. That was, wow.
Yeah, polar bear dogs. Think about
Really
it.
incredible to think about. Anyway, we have some great questions from the audience here. Let's start out with this one. How closely can we trace the evolution / domestication of different breeds of dogs through history? On a semi-related note, would it be possible to reverse engineer a wolf from a lap dog through breeding?
Woo. I wouldn't want to try that personally, but that's another question. Can it be done? Maybe. It's not only a question of genetics, it's a question of upbringing and exposure and what the little baby canid is exposed to. It is very clear that raising a wolf and raising a dog is not at all the same, really. And if you want to be able to live with the animal, which is presumably the intention, you have to be there from the beginning, very early, and you have to expose the puppy to particular things that have to do with its upbringing, its behavior, its knowledge of strange things, just having something new. What is that experience like, and how does the animal react to it? So I would guess maybe you could. I'm not sure why you would.
Yeah, I imagine it was more of a sort of theoretical, out of curiosity question than
Well, there are
anyone
people
actually wanting
trying
to do that.
to breed up mammoths
That's true. Yeah.
or you know, the beautiful horses that we see in Lascaux and the other caves. Um,
Yeah.
you
For
can always
science.
make it look like that.
Yeah. All right. Here's another one. This isn't specific to dogs, but do you have thoughts about, and you guys touched on this a little bit, but do you have thoughts about the what seems to be growing trend of people keeping non-traditionally domesticated animals as pets, such as foxes and hedgehogs?
I think it's a terrible idea.
You thought you might say that? Yeah.
I think it's a terrible idea for the animal. It might end up being a terrible idea for the person. You know, after it eats your baby child, you may have different feelings about how fun this is to do, but you can't domesticate a species in one generation or probably even 10. The well-known experiment, the fox farm experiment that was carried out in Novosibirsk in Russia, say they got quote unquote domesticated foxes in 40 generations. But they weren't wild foxes when they started. They were foxes from fox farms that had been raised in captivity for a long time. And so it already made a certain amount of adjustment. Whether or not they were truly domesticated, they were more domesticated than the fox out there in the woods. But I don't know that they were going to breed true forever. And I don't think we can do that. And they were applying an extraordinary selective pressure to those foxes to get something that at least could arguably be called domesticated in 40 generations.
Yeah. It seems like folly in a lot of ways, but I
am really very opposed to it, and I think the cruelty involved in keeping animals in unnatural, confining, artificial circumstances should not be underestimated. I know people don't do it to be cruel,
right.
But I think it's just a really bad idea. And although I understand the value of zoos, and I understand and have seen good zoos where the animals are well cared for and happy and have enough space and have the right kind of things to eat and so on, I am very troubled about the ethics of keeping most wild animals in captivity. I don't think it's good for them.
I'm glad you touched on zoos. I was actually just about to ask that myself,
Yeah.
because it seemed like a good corollary to what we were just talking about. But okay, and here's another sort of related question. With regard to the discussion of domestication, I keep struggling with that word for some reason. How would you classify animals that are commonly kept as pets but don't generally develop the same kind of relationships with their owners as dogs and cats? I'm thinking of things that generally live in tanks or cages, like snakes, lizards, fish, etc.
Okay. I think something that lives underwater is never going to have the same relationship with humans because we can't, and we don't. And we may visit the medium, and I personally love snorkeling and watching animals and watching fish and eels and crabs and all those marvelous creatures. I'm never going to have the relationship with those animals that another water-dwelling animal has. I just can't. I don't get it. I'm not one of those. Then there are reptiles, iguanas, lizards, terentes, all kinds of quite remarkable and fascinating animals. And I'd be worried about the moral implications of keeping that kind of animal in captivity in a cage or a tank, or how much room could you give the animal? If it's something that lives anywhere in the Sahara, say, or the Great Sandy Desert of Australia, or, deserts everywhere, deserts in Saudi Arabia, deserts in Israel, deserts in Africa. We're restricting and limiting their life experiences and their abilities. And, I am uncomfortable with some of that. And yet I have cats. They are very beloved and very spoiled cats. I can't let them outside where I live because it would not be safe. I actually saved one of them from the jaws of a coyote once. And as I think about that whole encounter, I was damn lucky the coyote gave the cat up, because I probably would have grabbed it around the throat and been killed myself, or been maimed. I was that involved in trying to save an animal that was very dear to me. So, yeah,
they're complicated. There's no
they're very
simple answer to
complicated
these.
moral
Yeah.
and philosophical issues.
Yeah. Well, I think, that's how it goes. Yeah.
I'm not wise enough to have an all-encompassing answer.
Yeah. Who would be? I don't, there isn't one.
Yeah.
Just a couple more here. If all free breeding canid populations are neutered or destroyed, do pedigree populations contain sufficient genetic diversity to last far into the future?
Okay. I believe so, because canids are highly variable. They do interbreed cross species. So they might, if any of us live far into the future, frankly. But it is also true, for example, that if you look at wild living canids in Australia, which has been done a lot, feral dogs don't do as well as dingoes, which are, I believe, a feral species. And some of their adaptations to a very difficult environment. Australia's the driest continent, huge distances between what we would call civilization or just water. Water sources are key to survival. Feral animals don't do as well because probably an animal that is actually a domesticated animal loses some of the adaptations that would help keep it alive if it had not come from a domestic stock. So would we still have dogs? Yes, dogs are everywhere. And they range from little itty bitty to great big hulking galumphing dogs. And they have the most remarkable genetic adaptations, just staggeringly wonderful adaptations. Wendy owns a border collie, as I mentioned, and he loves herding things. She tells me she once had a German Shepherd that was convinced that anybody who went in the water or on the water in a boat was going to drown. And so the German Shepherd would go and tug it into shore.
Whether Bonnie knew the person or not, she was intent on saving the life of that human being. And no one ever trained her to do that. She was like that when I got her as a puppy, and lived her whole life saying, no one can go on that water. If you go in a canoe, I'm coming to get you. Watch out. It's just part of her nature.
Yeah.
But I think this is an interesting question. I hear that question as asking the question, and this, I know you've thought about this a lot, Pat. Is there such a thing as a default dog? What's the default dog? If we stop doing all the breeding and just let dogs do their thing, what would we end up with?
My suspicion is a dingo.
Or some version thereof.
This
Or
actually
some
ties
version
in
thereof.
really well with what I think will be our last question, which is, I'm curious what you think about the ethics of our species creating dog breeds whose distinctive physical characteristics come with a host of health problems. How should we address that in the 21st century?
Ethically, yes. There are always people who will do unethical things, preferably if money is involved. A responsible breeder is very alert for congenital defects and will actually put puppies down rather than sell them to some unsuspecting softie, rather than have them have any of a series of genetic problems. It's heartbreaking. I would have a very hard time breeding animals for sale in any case. But talk about softies, I'm, one of your originals. So that if somebody is not a responsible breeder and makes too many puppies or too many kittens or too many koalas, whatever they are, from a given stock, they aren't being responsible. They aren't working for the good of the animals or the good of the ecosystem, frankly. There are always people who are going to do things like that. And I hope there are fewer and fewer of them, but I can't stop people. I can't even persuade people to have their animals fixed, which I think if you're not prepared to take the offspring and keep them the rest of their lives, you probably really ought not have any. That's a pretty extreme point of view. And I apologize if that offends people. I apologize for offending them, not for what I said, not for my opinion, but
good distinction.
yeah, it's just the planet is limited. There are only so many square feet available to us. There's only so much food. There's only so much water. We have to start thinking about that. And we have to start thinking about what we're doing to the soil. And then about if we're making animals that are going to be crippled all their lives because they've got bad hip joints, or whose eyes will have to be removed because they're malformed or infected. I just think that's a terrible thing to do.
Great. Well, on that note, I think we will close out. Thank you both. This was really illuminating and just really fascinating. And all of these issues are thorny, but really interesting to think about and important to consider. So thank you both for this. And thanks to all of you out there for spending your afternoon with us. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, keep reading. Check out Our Oldest Companions on harvard.com, which through the link in the chat, and stay well. Thank you
And
all.
go hug your dog.
Yes.
I think I will. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.